Hello everyone, I am Zil Bharat. I and my partner Dhruvita Dhamelia, we are going to discuss an article Comparative Literature in India, an overview of its history by Subha Chakraborty Das Gupta. Beginning with the introduction of the writer, Subha Das Gupta is a visiting professor in the Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literary Studies, University of Delhi. Previously professor at the Department of Comparative Literature, Jadavpur University, and coordinator of a special assistance program of the department of several years, where she undertook many projects in comparative literature and translation. This is an abstract of an article. The essay gives an overview of the trajectory of a comparative literature in India, focusing primarily on the department of Jadavpur University where it began, and to some extent the Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literary Studies in the University of the Delhi, where it later had a new beginning in its engagement in Indian literature. The Department of Jadavpur began with legacy of Rabindranath Tagore's speech on world literature and with a modern poet-translator as its founder. While British legacies in the study of literature were evident in the early years, there were also subtle efforts towards the decolonizing process and an overall attempt to enhance and nurture creativity gradually. Indian literature began to receive prominence along with literatures from the southern part of the globe. Paradigms of approaches in comparative literary studies also shifted from influence and analogy to the studies of cross-cultural literary relations to the focus on reception and transformation. In the last few years of the comparative literature has taken a new perspectives engaging with different areas of culture and knowledge, particularly those related to marginalized spaces, along with the focus on recovering new areas of non-hierarchical literary relationships. These are the contents of the article. We will look the beginnings, Indian literature as comparative literature, centers of comparative literature studies, reconfiguration of areas of comparison, research direction, interface with translation studies and cultural studies, and non-hierarchical connectivity. Beginning with the beginnings, long before this comparative literature was established as a discipline, there were texts which were focusing on comparative aspects of literature in India, both from both point of view, from other in the other parts of the world and also inter-Indian literary studies. The idea of world literature gained grounds towards the end of the 19th century, that is in Bengal, when the translation activities began to take place in the large scales, and the poets started to talk about the literature to be promoted to the world. The eminent poet translator of Bengal, Satyendranath Datta, in 1904 stated relationships of joy. As we have also discussed before, that Rabindranath Tagore's talk on Vishwa Sahitya in National Council of Education in 1904 is working as a base or a pretext for the comparative studies in India, and it has also served as a pretext to the establishment of the Department of Comparative Literature at Jadavpur University in 1956, and in the same year the university was also started functioning. The National Council of Education was a parent body of the university, and the council which was established was by the group of intellectuals. The work of this group was in order to bring about the system of education that would be indigenous, that is raw, catering to the needs of the people, and the most important is different, which is also I have also noted, different from the British system of education prevalent at the time. The Tagore's word Vishwa Sahitya had a complex meaning. It said it gave the sense of community of artists as workers building together to edifice the world literature. Here, the notion of the literature again was deeply embedded with the human relationship. Hence, the aesthetic sense was linked with the sense of human. So one critic which is quoted here is Buddhadeva Bose. He did not argue with he didn't agree with the idealistic view of Tagore, but quoted his writing and discipline in his discipline quoted Rabindranath Tagore's Vishwa Sahitya several times in his work. This work Buddha Deva Bose translated from the French with an idea to move away from the literature of the British, that is the colonial masters, and it translated Kalidasa's Meghdoot with an idea that literature of an ancient time should be there in a particular time also. It was like a beginning of a decolonizing process. Another is Sudhindra Nath Datta, who has also translated the French writers Mallarmé's work. That also translation for comparison in the literature. Naresh Guha, who has served as the chairperson of the department for 2 decades, and in an interview he has said that the role of this Department of Comparative Literature, is to foster an intensively creative environment. Despite comparative literature is working as a decolonizing process, the framework was evident. Having a colonial framework was evident in the syllabus or in a pedagogic structure. Here we have written about that also. Despite certain impulses towards the decolonizing process, the colonial framework was also evident in pedagogic structure, in the large scale given to English literature and the organization of the courses around the Renaissance, the Enlightenment and the Romantic and the Modern. Of course, there were several other courses devoted to Sanskrit and Bengali literature. The epistemological of comparison emerged within this framework. In the beginning, in the early stages of comparative literature, recognizing new aesthetic system, new visions of the sublime and the new ethical imperatives was prominent. That is comparison between the Greek drama and the Indian Nataka. Later, in the further period, the question of linking social and historical structures with aesthetics in order to reveal the dialectic between them became prominent. Core of this section, in a brief we can say that when the syllabus began, they were focusing on the comparison of the drama and how they were written, but later they started linking them and with a social and historical background. This syllabus had a core of the comparison between Iliad and Ramayana, and between Sanskrit and Greek drama, taking both Aristotle's poetics and Bharata's Natya Shastra into consideration. Radhakrishnan has said that this project did not bring existence of new object or subject of knowledge. By this discipline, there was nothing new in the knowledge system, but by laying out the terms of comparison, it did start a chain of reflections that would constitute the materiality of comparison, an ongoing series of engagements with the multidimensional reality of questions related to the self and others, to arrive at network of relationship of other levels. The journal, Jadavpur Journal of Comparative Literature, which was published in 1961, played an important role. The next topic which we will see is Indian literature as a comparative literature. Indian literature entered into syllabus not from the point of view of asserting the national identity, but studying a text with the network of relationships. The nodal component of the nodal component of comparative literature was themes and forms. Modern Indian language department established in 1962 at Delhi University was a focal point for the engagement of all the comparative literature. In 1974, Department of Modern Indian Languages started post-MA course entitled Comparative Indian Literature, and the national seminars were also organized, and the volume entitled Comparative Literature was established in 1977. Later in 1994, a MA course of Comparative Indian Literature began in the same department. The juxtaposition of different canons had led to the questioning of universalist canons right from the beginning of comparative studies in India. And now, with the focus of shifting to Indian literature and in some instances to the literature from the southern part of the globe, one moved further away from subscribing to a prior questions related to the canon formation. There was a shift from the Sanskrit concept to the Sanskrit-centric study to the conceptual study. Older definition of Indian literature often with only Sanskrit at the center, with the focus of a new canonical text to the by the neglect of others. Particularly oral and performative traditions had to be abandoned. One also had to take a more inclusive books at histories of literature in different languages of India. Uh, uh, it did not do justice to the overlap between the social formations, histories, and languages, and to the multilingualism that formed the very core of Indian literature. And this task was given by Ajaz Ahmad. It was to trace the dialectic of unity and difference through systematic periodization of the multiple linguistic overlaps, and by grounding that dialectic in the history of material production, ideological struggles, competing conceptions of class and community and gender, elite offensive and popular resistance, overlaps the culture vocabularies and performative genres and histories of orality and writing print. Indian literature is mainly looking at the interplay between the mainstream and the popular, elite and the marginalized, and at the same extent foreground intermediate perspective as different form existed in it. It also meant looking at interactions taking place within literatures in regions beyond the geopolitical boundaries of the nation state. Sisir Kumar Das has given an idea that Indian literature was not studied as a discrete unit but in a dialogue with one another. The teaching materials which were developed by the department were focusing on the language origins, manuscript cultures, performative traditions, along with painting, sculptures, and architecture, the history of print culture, and questions related to the modernity. We see that comparative literature studies are necessarily interdisciplinary. T.S. Satyanath has developed the theory which is cryptocentric, body-centric, and phonocentric. To look the medieval period, leading a number of researchers of the department to look for a continuous and interventions in the tradition that would again lead to the pluralistic epistemology. We see that in the Delhi University there were students from the different parts of India which gave them multiple points and a diverse intercultural relationship which helped more in the growth of comparative literature. The next topic we will see is the centers of comparative literature. Here we see that the centers and the departments developed a lot in the 70s and 80s in the South India in areas such as Trivandrum, Madurai, Kamraj University, Bhartidasam University, Kottayam and Pondicherry. A full-fledged comparative literature studies department was established in Madurai Kamraj University. The one of the reputed poet, author, and critic to be remembered here is K. Ayappa Panikar. In Tamil, apart from the studies related to the comparison of text, the two different cultures, that is classical Tamil text was compared to the text of Greek, Latin and Japanese counterpart traditions. While in the 1880s and the 90s, the other departments and centers were opened in Punjabi University, Patiala, Dibru University, Baba Saheb Ambedkar, to SNDT Mumbai's University, Mumbai. Many places opened up by the 80s, while the full-fledged Department of Comparative Literature was opened in 1986 in Surat, that is Veer Narmad South Gujarat University, then in 1999 in Kuppam and in 1992. In 1992 is to be marked as the two pioneer or a beginner of a comparative literature, that is Delhi University and Jadavpur University merged together and formed an association of a comparative literature, that is Comparative Literature Association of India. The last topic of mine is reconfiguration of areas of comparison. That is how the rearrangements were made in the syllabus or the study of comparative literature. When the 80s began, along in the Jadavpur University in the 80s, along with the Indian literature, Gabriel Garcia Marquez' 100 Years of Solitude became a part of a syllabus with a few other texts from Latin America literatures and the literatures from African countries. It included the questions of solidarity and desire to understand resistance to oppression, along with larger questions of epistemological shifts and strategies to bridge gaps in history, resulting from colonial interventions, and often the structuring components of these areas in the syllabus. During moving towards later during the 90s, the area studies paper was introduced. The area studies is a study of a region of a text or a literature we are reading. The area studies paper on Africa, Latin America, Canadian literature and the literature of Bangladesh. Area studies focused on Gradually, the field of studies focusing on oral traditions emerged within the space of comparison. We saw before that the oral traditions and performing traditions were getting abandoned, but here simultaneously the focus on them was also increasing. What happened by the area studies was it led to the division of the scarce resources. The scarce resource in the departments was more about faculties. They had less faculties, and due to the more of the area studies, that led to the division. It also diverted attention from some of the key challenges in the comparative studies in India. The key challenges were the systematic amalgamation of data related to Indian context and its analysis from comparative perspectives, and the mapping of intercultural relationship with and among India's neighboring country. Due to the area studies, this everything the mind was or the study was diverted from these focused areas. Components from the diverse area studies could possibly have been included as an integrated part of the main curriculum. The further after area studies, the thing which was focused was about reception studies. Uh, the question of the question on the influence study was questioned that why we are focusing on the influence, and which gave a change to the reception studies, talking of that is the receiver and not the emitter was in the focus, as we have once discussed in the class that influence was more from the colonial text of the colonial masters, and with growing time we started talking about the reception, how a reader was receiver to the text. This also implied that the receiver was taking the elements of another culture in accordance to her own needs and or the needs of a system, while the foreign elements underwent a transformation in accordance with forms, elements and ideologies in operation in the system of a given moment. So it was not a question of a dominating culture imposing the literature on another. Reception studies pointed out historical realities to complex configuration between literature and history. Here we are given the example of romanticism, and it is said that romanticism of a particular kind had an easy access on the realm of the Bengali literature, but it was romanticism that did not accept many of the European elements. And with the example of Wordsworth, Shelley and Byron, several things are explained that how it is affecting or related to the Bengali literature. We will take an example of Shelley. Shelley, the poet of revolt. It was taking a prominent place in the Bengali literature, or was adapted or had a good reception studies in Bengali literature when the independence movement was going on a large scale in the Bengal. As we read here that the receiver was taking elements from the another culture in accordance with her own needs. The Bengal was taking the romanticism according to its needs. The poet Shelley as a poet of revolt. Then the question arised about the Shakespeare. Here is about Shelley, a poet of revolt, began to have a very positive reception when the independence movement gathered momentum. The another context, the particular question which gained a prominence and which was answered by Shishir Kumar Das was Shakespeare was imposed on Indian literature. Then we see that Shakespeare was a rich and had a rich and varied reception in the world of theatre. Parsi theatre was given a new energy by the enactment of comedies of Shakespeare. Political theatre groups appropriated these plays, while critics in different periods interpreted Shakespeare in accordance with the needs of the time. From reception study, the focus gradually turned to cross-cultural reception through reciprocity and exchange among the culture war studies. For example, one tried to study romantic movement from a larger perspective to unravel its many layers as it traveled between countries, particularly between the Europe and India. The translation of several texts from Sanskrit into German played a role of emergence of a romantic movement. And then in the late 19th and early 20th, Romanticism came back to India through different shades. Amya Dev has contributed in the syllabus of the MA course which began and in the late 80s. The master syllabus had genres, themes and literary historiography as at its core. Then reception studies both along vertical and the horizontal line formed a next major area of the focus. Once one group studied there were two groups of the papers in which the one group studied Indian literature at the center and the other group studied Western literature. But as students were not happy with this division, then the semester system was introduced and the cross-cultural literary transactions where Rudyard Kipling's Scheme and Rabindranath Tagore's Gora were compared and studied. Uh, the some in courses entitled Literary Transactions, one looked more precisely at the tradition of reason and rationalism in Europe and Indian literature of the 18th and the 19th century. Here I missed the point about the syllabus also studied about the one's Vedic, Upanishadic, Buddhist and Jain elements in the modern text. They also studied cluster of sermons by Buddha, Mahavira and Nanak, the early novels in different Indian literatures and then impact of Eastern literature and thought on Western literature and vice versa. So here we have till now we have seen that how it began in Jadavpur University, then how its university came developed, how its syllabus was emerging with new improvements and keeping students in the focus, and how the departments and all the centers were beginning in the India. Now the further points are about the research direction in the same topic and the connection of translation studies and cultural studies and non-hierarchical connectivity, which will be related by Dhruvita.
How research direction are developed in the field of comparative literature is my part. So in the late 19th and the early 20th century, it was the time when research in the field of comparative literature was started in, and many colleges or the department get grants and the assistant or commission for the study. As for example, in the department of Calcutta University was receive a grant and commission for the studying comparative in the university. In the English department of Kolkata also received assistant to pursue research on the literary relation between Europe and the Indian in the 19th century. That was the time when the research about the relation of European country and the Indian started many in the many departments. Several books and the translation also are published about the publication also happen in this time. Mostly they are studying about this Indian Renaissance, how India get freedom and everything is the part of the research on comparative literature. They were dealing with the four aspects of the mainly they focus on the four aspects. One is the East-West literary relation, Indian literature, translation study, and the third world literature. And that there was the one professor named Manvendra Banopadhyay who translated several books and the texts in the Indian into English. Or the in the next phase of in after that next phase one in the support of given to the themes genre and the literary historiography in the field of the research project related to annotated bibliography or a periodization in the history of literature also resulted in two texts. There are the different ways of conceiving of periods, opening up perspective on how some of the popular concept could be revisited and the restudy. That there was the one field like romanticism was very different dimension in the context of India, in the context of Western study. So there is a writer Hemanta Kumar Sharma give a new name to romanticism as who divided in two parts: pre-romanticism and post-romanticism. Post-romanticism, also called as a post-Swaraj. In the post-romanticism, seamlessly used post-Swaraj erase the simple equation between Eastern and the Western theories. Under the special assistant program, there are the mainly 8 workshops were held for the studying Indian language in the relation of the neighboring language. For example, in the context of the Odia or Orissa language, there is the Bengali language. In the context of the Punjabi language, there is the Hindi language. So basically, the purpose of the research was that they are studying Indian language with the context of the neighboring language. So to understand the context of the other literature or the workshop are quite successful as that was the time where many publication also happened. It was the new thing for at that time the comparative literature was the new term or the learning of the or workshop also quite new things in at that time. What emerged from overview in the many special assistant program was that there was a concerned effort in different parts of the country to gradually build a archive of material related to the study of Indian literature in different manifestation, including in the intersection with other culture and literature. The department the department at Jadavpur University was at that time the department of Jadavpur University upgraded with the status of the center advanced study in 2005, and it upgraded to take a new turn in the comparative literature. The need to foreground the relevance of study literature was becoming more and more urgent in the face of the new society. In favor of technology and science, the development happened a lot, and this is lead to the away from the humanity as a technology and the science develop in the field of the comparative literature at that time. And they were studying comparative literature as the knowledge system as a one discipline to knowing the literature in the some another way as the theme as the one kind of a discipline. Only literature as a knowledge system therefore became a thrust area for again it was felt that comparative literature with the interdisciplinary formation would be the right place to demonstrate the same. A series of a workshop were conducted with the scholar of philosophy, history, science, and the social science to look into areas of creativity and knowledge. They are mainly focusing on the how something to be done with creativity and the knowledge system. A large focus, therefore, in the area was on the oral text and the research on the method of engaging with the such text. They are largely focused on the how, as the history of the India is the history we came to know about oral system. So they are focusing or they have a benefit that literature of that time is orally. So it became kind of helpful to them to connect with this, and people also have the idea of oral system, so they can connect with the comparison also. It must be mentioned at this point that in the late 19, in the early 20 following decade, there was a constant demand for engagement with literature of marginalized community in different platform. That was a time where comparison was also became with the marginalized community. As for example, there was a Dalit literature was also became a part of a comparison. But in some schools that it was became successful, but in some it was still marginalized. The National Association held two major conferences on the subject during the period. A particular project in this area taken up by the Department of Comparative Literature as a Jadavpur University called Vanishing Seeds of Culture based on a study in Bankura district of West Bengal. The in the studying the seeds of the Bengal literature is to connect with the rice, as the Bengal literature mostly connect with the rice. So they are studying rice literature with the folk culture of this country. In the second area, in the Center for Advanced Study, was the interface between literature of India and the neighboring country. This happened to be completely untouched area as far literature was a concerned apart from the study of certain well-known points of contact. The first preliminary research in area lead to links that link the suggested community and a constant series of interaction between among Asian culture and community. They are comparison between Asian country and the relation with the state with another state. Effort toward this end led to the International Conference on the South to South Dialogue with a large number of participation from Asian and European countries. Among the project planned under the Inter-Asian series was one in travelogue from Bengal to Asian. They are also comparison or experience from the news or clips or the article or publication of that how travelers have experience of this culture as Western and Indian culture. Interface with translation study and cultural study. In 21st century, English with two other related fields of study, one translation study and cultural study. Almost all departments of the Center of Comparative Literature today have a course of translation study and cultural study. In one of the two departments have already this thing in Hyderabad University, which was involved doing translation study for a considerable period. Today, the university has a full, full course of the translation and research association. Almost all department or a center of comparative literature today have a course on translation or translation study. As for cultural study, comparative literature has always engaged with different aspects of cultural study, the most prominent being literature in relation with the different arts. Today, study in intermediary in comparative literature are common, but beyond such a study, course in comparative pose with related texts from the Indian context. In the many department university, the comparative literature became part of the MPhil study also. There is a gender, sexuality, and the politics identity also. Cultural study maybe also in Delhi University takes up the theme of city and village. They are try to compare the life of city and the village theme also is part of the comparative study. Non-hierarchical connectivity. It is evident that comparative literature in the country today has become a part of the department or the part of the research, but many things has to be done is still remain. There is development in study and a new aspect also to be done. Subject and complex history of as is Sangari in the recent article called Co-Construction, a process anchor in subtle and complex history of translation, curriculation and extraction, and a compassed work with knowledge that a lot remain to be done in the task of construction of literary history. In the term of literary relation among neighboring region and larger worlds, one of the primary tasks of comparative literature today has perhaps yet to begin in all its endeavors. However, the primary aim of some of the early architect of the discipline to nurture and foster creativity and continue as a subterranean force. As many things has to be done, still remain. So that is.